Tonight on KQED Newsroom, author and historian Kamiya joins us to talk about transit in San Francisco, how it's changed over the years, and where it may be going next.
All public transit agencies in the United States have now entered the public transit death spiral.
Plus, California politicians react to the verdict in the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. And a surprise announcement from Representative Jackie Speier. We'll get the latest from our panel of political experts. Then, let's rock and roll in this week's edition of Something Beautiful. Coming to you from KQED headquarters in San Francisco, this Friday, November 19th, 2021. Hello and welcome to the show. This is KQED Newsroom, and I'm your host, Priya David Clemens. Let's kick off our show with the Friday Five, a look at some of the top news stories in California. As we enter the holiday season, about 67% of Californians are fully vaccinated, even as COVID cases continue to creep up. Also, Governor Newsom keeps warning us of a winter surge in infections, and state health officials clarified their guidance to say they're recommending that essentially all adults get a COVID vaccine booster. California's gasoline prices reached new heights this week. According to the AAA, the average price of a regular gallon has hit a record $4.69, more than $1 above last year's price at the same time.
Who's got the power?
An estimated 60,000 nurses, psychologists, and other Kaiser healthcare workers have gone on strike. The workers are striking in solidarity with Kaiser engineers, who've been striking for 2 months and are demanding wage increases. California is expected to have another budget surplus for the next fiscal year, totaling $31 billion. The reason? Well, despite the pandemic, many of California's businesses are booming, which provides significantly more taxable income. Coho salmon are getting some help to thrive from the federal government. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation is providing $2.7 million to protect the threatened fish in the Klamath River, which flows through California and Oregon. And that's this week's Friday Five. Coming up, we'll delve into the new documentary, Moving San Francisco. But first, we turn to political news, including California reactions to the verdict in the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Earlier this week, Democratic Congressmember Jackie Speier announced she would not seek another term in office. Speier has worked in politics for more than 40 years and has represented San Francisco and San Mateo residents in Congress since 2008. Also, Vice President Kamala Harris is finding herself on the defensive after a poll put her approval ratings at a dismal 28% earlier this month. Joining me now are KQED politics and government correspondent Marisa Lagos. Hi, Marisa.
Hi, Priya.
And Los Angeles Times columnist Mark Zbarabak. Hi, Mark.
Hey there.
Okay, so first, let's discuss the reaction from California politicians to the verdict in the Kyle Rittenhouse case in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So the jury said today that Rittenhouse was not guilty of the charges of killing 2 men and wounding a third with a semi-automatic rifle. Marisa, what is the response coming out of our state leaders?
Yeah, not as much as you might have expected, although we are taping this earlier in the day, so we'll have to see how that progresses. I was a little surprised at actually how forceful the governor's statement was. He tweeted out, "America today, you can break the law, carry around weapons built for a military, shoot and kill people and get away with it," and went on to saying that that's basically the message being sent to vigilantes around the nation today. So strong words. We did hear Kevin Kiley, who was one of his Republican challengers in the recent recall, shoot back on Twitter saying that, Gavin Newsom is attacking this Rittenhouse jury, that ordinary citizens reaching a decision based on evidence in the law goes against everything he stands for. So kind of not surprisingly, because I feel like a lot of the debate around this whole, incident and the trial has been very much along political lines.
And we will certainly be watching to see if there are protests that unfold, both, of course, in Wisconsin, but here in the Bay Area as well over the weekend. And so, Mark, I want to turn to a different topic now. The House has passed Biden's social safety net and environmental package, the Build Back Better bill, and it's now gone to the Senate. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy from Bakersfield gave an 8-hour-long speech to stall the vote. What did McCarthy make of this? Why did he do this?
Well, in Washington, they have what's called a magic minute. And only in Washington can you talk 8 hours and 32 minutes and still be within that minute parameter. I mean, look, Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy do not like each other. They do not respect one another. So I think there may have been a certain amount of one-upsmanship. The previous modern record for a speech was given by Nancy Pelosi. So Kevin McCarthy one-upped her in that instance. But this was really aimed at his caucus. This was aimed at his fellow Republicans. If as seems likely, if it seems likely Republicans take over the House, Kevin McCarthy is in line to be Speaker, but he was passed over once before, and there are a lot of Republicans in that caucus who aren't happy with Kevin McCarthy, who don't think he fights hard enough, who didn't like the fact that 13 Republicans voted for what's called the hard infrastructure piece of that package. So he had to go out there and make a stand and fight. And he got a lot of backslaps and a lot of high fives afterwards from members who felt that he did that. It was futile, but he went out there and he held the floor and he fought, quote, quote.
Some political positioning then. All right. Let's turn to Representative Jackie Speier. She has been a powerhouse in the Bay Area for many years, and she visited us here in KQED Newsroom in 2018. Let's listen to a little bit of what she had to say then and come back and talk about her work.
I think everyone should take a sedative. I really think that it's going to require us to calm down and then become very vigilant, because John Bolton, along with Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, are responsible for taking our country into the longest war in our history, and that is the Iraq War, 15 years. We've spent over $3 trillion there. That's $24,000 for every household in this country.
So, Marisa, why don't you tell us a little bit more about Representative Speier's impact and why she's stepping down?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about all the amazing policy sort of things that she has pushed. I mean, she really made a name for herself in Sacramento, first as a state lawmaker, pushing for things like correction guard reform, prison reform. She went on to take on the military in D.C., really just, I think, hold their feet to the fire in a way that had not been done before around sexual assault and like making that accountability happen. But you can't talk about Jackie Speier, Priya, without talking about her remarkable life. A lot of people know that she was in Jonestown and got shot during that horrific event in the 1970s. But she went on, she was a staffer at the time. She was a young woman. She went on to run for the state legislature and just have so many incredible personal tragedies befall her. Worked so hard to get pregnant, and when she finally did, her husband was killed in a car accident. Just on and on, these things beyond Jonestown that she overcame, and she's talked a lot about how that gave her the strength to take on these bigger fights.
Well, her seat is in this deep blue congressional region, right? So we think that her seat is safe for the Democrats. They definitely feel like they have this seat locked down. But Mark, you say not so fast for several of the seats throughout California. You wrote an article for the LA Times this week titled, "Don't Look Now, but Deep Blue California has become a congressional battleground." What sort of shifts are you seeing?
Well, it's interesting. California is pretty much a no-go zone for Republicans running statewide. But as I said, that's changed on the congressional front. And one big reason is this commission. And people are complaining about this, that, and the other thing. We have citizens who are drawing the lines. Politicians used to do it. And they did a redrawing after the 2000 census. We had hundreds of House races over that whole decade. Only one changed hands because Republicans and Democrats shook hands basically to protect their own. It was an income protection plan. That's one of the reasons that voters in California voted to take away that line drawing from politicians and give it to less self-interested individuals. So we have that citizen commission, and the result is we have much more competitive districts. And then the other thing that's going on goes back to Donald Trump, who has hastened some changes we've already seen in two areas in particular. Orange County used to be synonymous. You thought Orange County, you thought Republicans, you thought conservatives. It's where Ronald Reagan famously said all good conservatives go to die, or go after they die, they go to heaven, they go to Orange County. That's changed. Orange County has become very, very competitive. And part of that reason is the suburbs. Donald Trump alienated a lot of suburban voters. They voted Democratic. Democrats picked up 4 seats there in 2018, gave back 2 of them in 2020. That's likely to be very competitive. And then other places, the Central Valley, depending how far you want to go back, if you want to go all the way back to the Dust Bowl days, it was a Democratic stronghold and was all the way up until really the 80s. And then once more, we saw that drift away from Democrats losing rural support, once more hastened under Donald Trump. So we're likely to see some competitive races there. All in all, now, it should be clear those maps are not finalized. They're going to be finalized by the end of the year. December 22nd, December 27th is the date. But we could end up with as many as 10 reasonably competitive races in California, which is a lot and certainly more than any other state in the country.
Right. Fascinating. Okay, let's go back to the national stage. Vice President Kamala Harris has been defending herself and her work this week after she received some truly spectacularly bad poll numbers. So she recently got a poll rating of 28%, lower even than Vice President Dick Cheney, who was wildly unpopular. So, Marisa, how did she get here? What does this mean?
Well, this was one poll, so I think we do have to have that asterisk. The LA Times has actually been putting together sort of an aggregate, and if you look at that, her numbers are still underwater, but she's more at like 41 favorable, 51 unfavorable. So not quite this 28%
approval, right?
Yeah. You know, polls are snapshots in time. I think there's a lot going on here. I think one of the things happening is that the president is not that popular right now, and she is yoked to him. I think that when you add, all of the sort of debate over this agenda and how long it's been dragged out, that is certainly hurting both of them. I think, we have to be clear. Kamala Harris has always been held to a higher standard than a lot of her white male peers. I think that there's a big difference in the way she is viewed than her predecessors, including Joe Biden. She also has a history of making missteps and having challenges running offices and kind of getting her staff to get along. I think we're seeing some of that here. And then ultimately, she's got really high expectations. I mean, she came in, she's serving under the oldest president ever. There was this sense that she could be the heir apparent. I do think that when you add all this together, there's a lot of expectations on her. Finally, I'll just say this also. If you dig into a lot of these polls, the numbers shouldn't be surprising. We live in a polarized nation. Republicans are largely against Kamala Harris. Democrats are largely for her. College-educated voters like her. Less educated voters do not. A lot of the kind of lines that we see just among the political parties. So, it's early yet. They're not even a quarter through this term. So let's not write her
Give it a little time. Give it a little time. All right, Mark, back to state politics here. I've heard that former San Diego Mayor Kevin Faulconer is considering running against Governor Newsom in the general election next year. You wrote about this. He did not do particularly well in the recall election. He came in a very distant third. So what's his thinking here? Why is there talk that he might be running?
Well, to hear him tell it, and you can't really dispute it, he said that the recall was kind of a circus, which it was. There were bears, and there was Caitlyn Jenner, and there was all that craziness surrounding it. And, his argument is that in a substantive one-on-one campaign, him against Gavin Newsom, he could do much better, which is true. But he's got to get to that one-on-one election before he can even have these substantive conversations. I mean, he faces a problem that Republicans running statewide have faced for quite a number of election cycles now, which is this. They have to appeal to the base of the Republican Party. They have to be conservative enough. These days, they have to be Trumpy enough not to put those people off. But by making that appeal, then you alienate the larger number of Democrats and independents. So, we had this conversation about, he kept saying, well, if I could get Gavin Newsom, one-on-one, I mean, if I could, run a 4-minute mile, I could, do a really fast marathon. So talking about it versus making it happen are two different things. I mean, he's looking at it. He said he's going to make his decision in early next year. He said if he thinks it's going to be a repeat of what happened the last time, he's not going to do it. I don't see how it comes together, but I'm not the one who's making that decision.
Okay, well, it'll be fascinating to watch, as always. A viewer did remind us that last week we forgot to mention that in this whole missing Governor Newsom time period of about 11 days, Governor Newsom did pop up at a wedding for the Getty family, and the timeline didn't quite line up. It wasn't that he was supposed to be in Scotland at that point, but he was missing, and there was a lot of chatter around that. So I think it's going to be really interesting over this next year to keep looking at what happens with the governor, who is coming up to challenge him, and if they can really get any traction there. So Marisa, we really appreciate you being here, and Mark as well. Thank you.
Free will.
Our guest this evening is author and historian Gary Kamiya, who hosts a new documentary titled Moving San Francisco. The documentary chronicles the history of San Francisco's iconic cable cars and the creation of a first-in-the-nation transit authority. It also explores the impact of the latest wave of innovation in moving people around the city through gig economy services and driverless car technologies.
Always a city of firsts, San Francisco has long been a laboratory for how to move people across a difficult terrain. Out of the rubble and a riot, San Francisco invented the modern notion of city-owned transit.
Gary Kamiya joins us in studio now. Gary, welcome to KQED Newsroom.
Thank you very much, Priya. It's good to be here.
And I want to let our audience know as well, in addition to hosting this film, you have a long history here in the Bay Area. You were the executive editor of Salon.com, the executive editor of San Francisco Magazine, and you now write a column every week for the San Francisco Chronicle on history in this area. So you know it well.
Yes, it's my passion.
You know, what was interesting to me about this film is that it was really a sociological review of what transportation means to us in community. And it looks at what transportation reveals about who we are, what our values are, and what we believe in. Was there a story from this film that really kind of exemplified that for you, that showcased our values?
Yeah, I mean, there's many. There's one of the most remarkable stories is the tale of this pioneering African-American businesswoman named Mary Ellen Pleasant, who was a very wealthy woman, very well known, but in 1866 she was denied the ability to board a streetcar.
And we actually have a little clip of that, so let's play that, and then we'll come back and hear this story.
Nearly 100 years before Rosa Parks and the bus boycotts of the American South, a little-known African-American entrepreneur in San Francisco named Mary Ellen Pleasant stood up for her right to ride transit. She had come to San Francisco at the height of the gold rush and began operating restaurants, boarding houses, even brothels.
So what happens next in Mary Ellen Pleasant's story?
So she is rebuffed from boarding this private streetcar company because she's black. But most people would have just, accepted that. But she was a very courageous, outspoken woman, and she sued the streetcar company, and she won. This is right after the Civil War. So I think she is a pioneering example of the kind of progressive values that at their best, have influenced the way that we've moved people across the terrain of San Francisco. A woman standing up for her civil rights, a black woman, long before that it was common to do so. So that's one example. There could be many. There's also the Great Freeway Revolt, which was essentially a coalition, but a major part of the coalition opposed to freeways that were going to just dominate San Francisco's landscape were just grassroots organizations, including a lot of housewives in Glen Park neighborhood. Which have
preserved that beautiful canyon.
Preserved that canyon.
Right.
That in their wisdom, the planners, at this point there was no opposition to freeways anywhere in the United States. It was this sort of technocratic vision that freeways are just going to dominate and allow people to zoom here and there, and they were going to run a freeway right across Glen Canyon. And it would have just profaned that incredible natural wonder. And these local women, led by this, saloon keeper's daughter named Minnie Stroud Baxter, led a citizens movement, and they ultimately prevailed over these very dismissive, mostly white men who, said, "No, you women just go back to your kitchens and shut up, and we'll take care of this." And but they prevailed, and they started a grassroots movement that ultimately prevented San Francisco from being completely just squeezed by the tentacles of 12 different freeways.
You do point out in the film that the freeways had to go somewhere, and that they then often bisected these communities of color and lower income communities. You take a hard look at equity.
Yes, well, that's the more unfortunate, the darker side. We've talked about two inspiring examples of citizens' action involving transportation. But San Francisco is not immune to the same socioeconomic forces other cities are, and power tended to control where the big infrastructure projects went, so that, you know, the richer, wider neighborhoods would be able to keep freeways out. The poorer neighborhoods, often with more people of color, ended up with the freeways going through them. It was ever thus, but it doesn't make it right. And of course, obviously, as I say in the film, it's not even desirable not to have any freeways, but it's unfortunate, to say the least, that freeways intended to blight neighborhoods that the less powerful, the less privileged, and often people of color lived.
And I think it's interesting because this film feels very much of the moment. You talk with various people in Oakland about how they're looking at changing those situations that have been brought about by these policies of the past, and really looking at, can they bring down freeways? How can they change the fabric of the places they live to make it more of a community, more of a connection, rather than having these places that are cutting across. I do want to turn to the early days of how San Francisco transportation was first put into place, because there were a lot of challenges these early developers had with the hilly terrain in San Francisco. And you say that real estate development tended to drive a lot of the development of transit.
Yes, absolutely. San Francisco's terrain is incredibly intractable. The early city was confined to a very small area by the hills and by the enormous sand dunes. There used to be 80-foot high sand dunes covering Market Street. So opening up the city required a lot of ingenuity. And in fact, one of the iconic symbol of San Francisco's transportation, the cable cars, came about to try to conquer the hills, and it also had a deeply humanitarian origin. Andrew Halliday, the man who invented it, witnessed a terrible accident with a horse-drawn streetcar where the horses slipped back and were, very horribly mangled. And he, determined right then and there he didn't want this to happen anymore. And so this led to this extraordinary invention of this endless wire rope, as they call it, that he had used in the Sierras to hold ore, but he had the incredible idea of putting it underground, and everyone thought he was just a visionary maniac and like a complete, had no chance of doing this. He had trouble raising the money. So there was a kind of a can-do and inventive entrepreneurial streak that's always characterized San Francisco that came out in that case, and it came out throughout the expansion of the city and the real estate interests, as you say. A lot of these early streetcars, it was what they call vertical integration. They were the very companies that were running streetcar lines into neighborhoods that had hitherto been sand dunes were owned by real estate interests, so that when they opened up these areas, they then profited both from the franchise of these streetcar lines and from the real estate that they then would build in these areas. So there was always a deep business interests in the expansion of San Francisco.
And you talk about the way in which San Francisco's public transit system became just that, was public rather than private. And so if you could tell us a little bit about how we ended up as a first in the nation city to put into place public transit, and the concerns that we have now about whether public transit can move forward and is viable.
Yes, well, in the 19th century, like all American cities, the mass transit franchises were privately owned. And in San Francisco, this led to enormous amount of corruption. There was just a lot of pay to play. Franchises would bribe the Board of Supervisors in order to get their franchises. And this went along, everyone put up with this for a really long time. But eventually a pioneering reform movement led by the progressive mayor Phelan and just a general revulsion against the corruption that had prevailed in urban affairs led to San Francisco becoming the first American city to actually have an urban-owned, a city-owned transit system, Muni.
And why is that threatened at this point?
Well, obviously, we now have, this very touchy situation, very worrisome situation, where mass transit is underfunded. We have not managed to make the switch yet away from the almighty automobile, which has dominated the planning of transit throughout the modern history of the United States. We are trying to beef it up. But the problem is when you don't have enough funds, it gets less riders, then there's even less money. And so the transit really needs an infusion of some fundamental rethinking of how important a role it needs to play in our society. And we've got to begin to move away from the reliance on the automobile. Obviously, things like Uber and Lyft have been important and important innovations, and they are very useful. There's a reason they're so popular. But going down that road alone is not going to solve our transportation problems. We need a robust public transit system as well.
So this has been a fascinating conversation. For those who want to hear more about what's next for the future of transit and public transportation, they can watch the film. It's going to be on KQED 9 right here on this channel on Monday night, November 22nd at 9 p.m. Gary, Kamiya, thanks for being here in studio with us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Priya.
2 weeks ago, we enjoyed skating on ice. This week, we're skating again, but indoors at the Golden Skate Roller Rink in San Ramon. With disco lights and a family vibe, it's this week's look at something beautiful. The Golden Skates management has announced they're closing the rink soon, but not until after the holidays, so there is still time to go skating. And that's the end of our show for tonight. Thank you for joining us. If you want to get a look behind the scenes, then please hang out with us online too. KQED Newsroom is on Twitter and Facebook, and you can reach me on Twitter at Priya D. Clemens. You can also email us at knr@kqed.org. Our show will be taking a break next Friday for the Thanksgiving holidays, so we'll see you in December. Have a great weekend and happy Thanksgiving.